Don't touch it. The boy's voice cracked as the glass edge shook in his hand. He stood planted at the foot of the dirt mound, knees locked, ribs sharp under his shirt. The bottle was broken wrong, jagged, wet with old blood. The cowboy reined his horse without a word and let the reins fall. The horse shifted, snorted, went still. The boy didn't blink. Don't come closer. The boy lifted the bottle higher. I'm already close. The cowboy slid one boot down, then the other, dust rising slow. You touch it, I cut you. I ain't touching nothing. Then leave. Can't. Why? Because you're starving. The boy's jaw clenched. His stomach growled loud enough to shame him. He hated that sound. He hated the way the man heard it and didn't smile. The cowboy stepped once more, stopped short of the grave, and bent down. He knelt like it mattered. His knee pressed into the dirt, close enough to feel the grave breathe heat. The boy stared, confused, angry, afraid. Don't kneel. The boy said it softer. Ain't kneeling to you. The cowboy pulled his hat off and set it on the ground between them. He kept his eyes low. Wind moved the grass. The cross at the head of the grave leaned sideways, burned black at the edges like someone tried to erase it with fire. No name. No dates. Just scorch and splinter. You guarding this? The cowboy said it plain. Someone has to. The boy swallowed. They'll dig her up. Who will? Everybody. The cowboy nodded like he believed him. He stayed still. Flies buzzed. The boy's arms shook. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He had watched the dirt all night like it might run. You can't stay here. The cowboy said it quiet. I can. You'll pass out. Then I'll wake up. With what? The bottle twitched. With this. The cowboy looked at the bottle, then at the boy's face. Sunken cheeks. Split lip. Eyes too old. He felt something break and didn't let it show. A crow called from somewhere beyond the fence line. The sound made the boy flinch. He shifted his feet, then set them again, like he was afraid the ground might open if he moved wrong. The cowboy noticed. He stayed kneeling. He breathed slow, made it visible, like teaching a scared animal how not to bolt. The boy watched his chest rise and fall. He tried to match it. Failed. Tried again. You alone? The cowboy asked. The boy shrugged. Not really. Ain't nobody else here. That's alone. The boy's mouth twitched. He didn't argue. The bottle dipped for half a second, then came back up. The cowboy didn't move. What's your name? Don't got one. That ain't true. The boy hesitated. Didn't answer. The cowboy nodded again. Fair enough. He reached slow into his coat and stopped halfway. The boy hissed. Don't. I ain't. Just food. He pulled out a strip of jerky and held it where the boy could see. Didn't throw it. Didn't move closer. I won't eat. Then you'll fall. I'll fall here. The cowboy lowered his hand. He set the jerky on the dirt by his hat. He didn't touch it again. He stayed kneeling. Minutes dragged. The boy's breathing went rough. His grip slipped. He hated that too. Why you here? The boy asked. Passing through. Lie. Maybe. Silence pressed down. The grave held it. The boy glanced at the cross, then back at the man. His voice dropped. She said someone would come. The cowboy's chest tightened. He looked up for the first time. She say my name. The boy lifted his head. Their eyes met. The cowboy stayed kneeling. He did not shift his knee. He did not reach for the food. He let the silence stretch until it hurt. The boy watched him like a test. The grave sat between them, the dirt still loose, still warm. The burned cross leaned like it was tired of standing. "You knew her." The boy said it like a challenge. The cowboy didn't look away from the dirt. "I knew everyone." "That ain't an answer." "It's the only honest one." The boy frowned, like he was weighing whether honesty mattered anymore. He crouched, keeping the bottle raised, and leaned toward the cross. He touched the blackened wood with 2 fingers, gentle, like it could feel pain. There was a name there. Not carved. Burned slow and deep. Letters uneven. Crooked like shaking hands. "Say it," the cowboy said. The boy swallowed. He said the name anyway. The sound of it changed the air. The grave felt less quiet. The land seemed to lean in. "They didn't bury her," the boy said. "Not right. They don't bury women like her." The cowboy nodded once. Sheriff made sure. Sheriff made sure she wasn't nothing. He erased her. The boy's jaw tightened. But the ground didn't forget. The cowboy stayed kneeling. His knee burned. He didn't mind. He took his hat off the dirt and held it in his hands now, twisting the brim. The boy noticed. "You shaking." The cowboy shrugged. "Happens. You ain't like them," the boy said. "That ain't praise." The cowboy met his eyes again. "I'll take it anyway." The boy's stomach growled again, louder this time. He cursed under his breath. The cowboy reached for the jerky again and stopped himself. He held it out halfway. "You eat." The boy shook his head hard. "You first." The cowboy blinked. "Why?" "So I know you ain't lying." "About what?" "About staying." The cowboy nodded. "Fair." He tore a piece off and put it in his mouth. He chewed slow. Didn't rush. Didn't hide it. He swallowed. Then he held the rest out again. The boy stared at it like it might disappear. He lowered the bottle just enough to grab the food. He ate fast, then stopped himself, embarrassed. Slowed down. Chewed. Swallowed. "You ain't eaten in a while," the cowboy said. 2 days. The boy wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "Maybe more. I lost count." "You thirsty?" The boy shrugged. "Ain't far to water." The cowboy followed his eyes. A dry ditch. A rusted pump. Nothing running. They didn't like her. The boy said again, like he needed to say it twice. "She talked." "About what?" "About what they did." "To her." "To others." The cowboy felt his jaw lock. He didn't ask more. "Not yet." "You gonna tell someone?" the boy asked. "Who?" "Anyone." The cowboy looked around. Empty land. Bent fences. A road that pretended not to see things. "I'm listening now." The boy nodded like that was something. The wind picked up. Dust moved across the grave. The boy stepped in front of it again, protective, fierce. The cowboy stayed where he was. He bit the last piece of jerky, chewed, swallowed. He wiped his hands on his pants. "Who put you here?" he asked it quiet. Not accusing. Just needing to know. The boy didn't hesitate this time. "She did. She told me to stay." The boy's voice was thin, almost swallowed by the wind rustling through the broken fence posts. He balanced on the balls of his feet, bottle still clutched, eyes fixed on the grave like it might speak back. The cowboy stayed kneeling, knee pressed into the dirt, hat in hand, watching him. He didn't push. He didn't speak. He just waited. "They'd lie." The boy said it, and the words hit like cold stones. "Who's they?" the cowboy asked. "All of them. Every last one." "You believe her?" "She was dying." "People don't lie then." The cowboy swallowed and nodded. There was no argument in that. He could see the ritual shaping the boy, the memory repeating itself, like an anchor keeping him tethered to a world that wanted to forget. The boy traced the edge of the cross with a trembling hand, blackened with scraping against his palm. He stared at it like it could remember her touch. "She told me to stay. To watch. To guard. Until the ground cools." The cowboy's eyes stayed on him. He didn't move, but his presence was a quiet insistence, something solid to lean against. "They came after her. Night. Screams." He said it like it was yesterday, even though it had been years. He didn't finish the story. The cowboy didn't ask. The boy's silence held more than the words could ever capture. The bottle shifted in his hand, a reminder that he was small but armed, that he could fight even without strength. "I stayed," he said. "I watched. Nobody else would. Nobody would care enough." The cowboy's lips pressed thin. He could feel the boy's fear like a pulse. The way he carried it, folded into himself, made the air heavy. He kept his knee down. He didn't offer comfort, didn't try to coax. Comfort would have been too loud. The wind moved again, through the empty fields, past the rusted fence wire. The boy shivered. He had nothing to cover him. Nothing to eat. Nothing to stop remembering. She said someone would come. That was supposed to be him. That was supposed to be the cowboy. He felt the weight of it settle across his shoulders. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then sharp. The boy froze, the bottle trembling in his grip. The cowboy stiffened too, hand hovering near his belt. "That's the sheriff," he said flat, almost like stating a fact, not a threat. The boy's eyes went wide. The ground between them felt smaller. The air tightened, tasted of dirt and sweat and fear. "He can't take it," the boy whispered, but the cowboy shook his head. "He's not alone. I'm here." The boy glanced at him, saw the calm in the man's posture, the deliberate stillness. It was a promise he didn't have words for. The sheriff would come. That was certain. But the boy might just survive it. The cross leaned, shadow moving over it as the sun shifted. The boy's stomach rumbled, louder than he wanted. The cowboy didn't flinch. He stayed kneeling. The boy's shoulders sagged. He wanted to eat, wanted to run, wanted to hide. He did none of it. He just kept his eyes on the grave, on the burned letters, on the man kneeling beside him. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint smell of smoke from a distant fire. The cowboy noticed, but he didn't say anything. He just stayed. The boy's hands were raw from clutching the bottle. He pressed them into the dirt. He whispered again, "She said they'd lie." The cowboy nodded. "That's why you stay." The boy nodded too, almost imperceptibly. He believed her. He believed the instructions, the ritual, the promise. Shadows lengthened across the field. The boy's teeth chattered faintly. He wasn't thinking about himself, not really. He was thinking about her, the one buried here, the one erased. He was thinking about the sheriff who would come and the men who would follow. He was thinking about keeping the promise, keeping the vigil, keeping the memory alive. The cowboy shifted slightly. Only a little. Not enough to startle the boy. Just enough to let him know he was still there, that he hadn't abandoned him, that he would face the sheriff too. The boy's breathing slowed, matched the rhythm of the man's kneeling. They were two shapes tied to one grave, one promise, one ritual. The hoofbeats drew closer, measured, steady. The boy's eyes flicked up to the horizon. He could see the dust rising where the sheriff's horse cut across the field. The cowboy's hat caught the last light of the sun. He lowered it again, letting the boy have it. "Take it." The boy didn't move. He just stayed, guarding, waiting, listening. The ground felt hot under the boy's hands, but he didn't pull away. He whispered again, almost to himself, almost to her, "I stay." The cowboy's eyes softened just a fraction. "That's good. That's enough for now." The sheriff would come, but the boy would not flinch. He had a witness. Someone who could stand beside him, who could bear the weight of what was coming. Time stretched, thin and sharp. Every breath of wind, every distant call of a bird, every shift of dust over the cross reminded them of the promise, of the reason they were there. The boy's hands were steady now, the bottle resting lightly against his leg. The cowboy stayed kneeling. Their eyes met once more, and for a brief, tense moment, the world held its breath. The first sign of the sheriff appeared, a flicker of movement over the hill. The boy tensed, ready to defend, ready to strike, ready to scream. The cowboy didn't move. He stayed kneeling, letting the boy know he was not alone. The ground beneath the cross remained undisturbed, sacred in its silence. The boy swallowed hard. The promise was heavier than he realized. He whispered it again, "She told me to stay." The cowboy nodded. "I'll stay too." The hoofbeats came closer, louder, carrying the weight of authority, the threat of violence. The boy didn't flinch. The cowboy didn't flinch. Together, they waited, shadows lengthening, the burned cross between them, the memory alive and demanding its witness. The sheriff was almost in sight now. The boy's hands tightened on the bottle, his stomach knotted. He looked at the cowboy, and for the first time, he allowed a flicker of trust. He could not see the man's face fully, but he could feel his presence, steady and sure. This was the arrival they had been promised. The boy stayed kneeling, guarding, waiting. The cowboy stayed kneeling beside him. The ground held its heat. The grave held its secret. And the world waited with them, tense and silent. The sheriff rode up slow, dust curling at the hooves, sun glinting off the badge on his chest. He smiled too wide, hands loose at his sides, voice soft and fake. "Son, you shouldn't be here." The boy's eyes narrowed, bottle raised. "He stays." "That ain't your call." "Then make it yours." The sheriff's smile flickered. Recognition crossed his face when he saw the cowboy kneeling in the dirt. History, old grudges, the weight of threats unspoken. The grave was a line in the dirt now, a dividing mark that no badge could erase. The sheriff dismounted carefully, boots crunching, circling the grave. He looked at the boy. "She was trouble," he said. "Trouble." The boy screamed it, voice ragged and raw, "She was my mother." Silence crashed down like a wall. The wind stilled. Even the horse shifted uneasily. The cowboy stayed kneeling, hat in hand, eyes calm but sharp. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His presence alone made the sheriff hesitate. The boy's hands shook on the bottle. He pressed it into the dirt as if stabbing the ground would make it harder for the sheriff to take her away. "Nobody touches her." The sheriff's lips thinned. He gestured to his deputies, subtle, careful. "No words." The boy spoke anyway. "She didn't do nothing wrong. She just lived. That's why they did it." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He understood. The sheriff stepped closer. "You're making this worse." "No," the cowboy said softly, "I'm making it seen." The boy watched the exchange, realizing this man would not back down, would not bend. His small body felt steadier somehow, bolstered by the quiet solidarity. The sheriff's hand hovered near his gun. The boy's eyes followed it. "Don't reach," the cowboy said quietly. The sheriff didn't. He smiled tighter, lips pulled thin over teeth. He glanced at the burned cross, at the fresh dirt, at the small figure of the boy guarding it like it was the center of the world. He had forgotten that people mattered more than law. That sometimes law was just a shadow. "You're breaking the rules," the sheriff said. "Maybe." The cowboy replied, voice low. "Maybe it's time they bend." The boy lifted his chin, watching, waiting, learning. The sheriff's face tightened. He barked an order to the deputies. "Move them. Take the boy away." The boy shook his head, bottle raised again, voice raw. "Never." The cowboy stayed kneeling, steady as the earth beneath them. The sheriff cursed under his breath. He had forgotten the weight of truth. He'd tried to bury it once, like they buried her. But the grave had a memory of its own. The boy was its witness. The cowboy was his shield. "You're not leaving," the boy said, not quite a demand, more a statement of fact. The sheriff stepped back, face dark. He measured the distance between them, realized brute force wouldn't win here. The cowboy finally lifted his eyes to the sheriff. "You've been here before," he said. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "We don't need this trouble." "Trouble's already here," the cowboy said. The boy pressed his hands into the dirt, feeling her presence through the soil, feeling it strengthen him. "This is where she belongs. This is where I belong." The sheriff spat, looked around, counted his deputies. Nothing. He couldn't move the ground. He couldn't erase the burned letters. He couldn't undo what had been done. And for the first time, he realized he might not have the power he always assumed he did. The boy's small body, the cowboy kneeling beside him, the cross leaning sideways, the dirt still warm, they were more authority than any badge. The boy whispered, almost to himself, tears burning at the corners of his eyes. "You can't take her from me." The cowboy reached out, hand hovering just above the boy's shoulder, letting him know he was not alone, that he didn't have to be. The sheriff's mouth opened, closed. He cursed again. His shadow fell across the grave, but it no longer held weight. The cowboy stayed low, breathing even, letting the heat of the day press on the sheriff's pride instead of on them. The boy's eyes didn't leave the man kneeling beside him. "This is my promise," he said quietly, voice breaking. "I guard her. I guard her." The sheriff turned, swore under his breath, and took a step back. The deputies looked to him for direction, but he had none. Authority had been tested, and it had failed. The boy dropped the bottle into the dirt. He sank to his knees beside the grave, hands pressed hard against the soil. The cowboy leaned slightly, not touching, just close enough to share the weight. The sheriff's voice cracked. "You don't understand." "I do," the cowboy said. "I understand too well." The wind picked up again, scattering dry leaves and dust across the cross, across the grave, across the two kneeling figures who refused to yield. The sheriff muttered once more, turned, and walked back to his horse. The deputies followed, silent, uneasy, unsettled by what they had seen, by what they could not undo. The boy stayed where he was, watching them leave, feeling the pulse of the land, the heat of the grave, the presence of the man beside him. He was small. He was hungry. He was furious. And he was not alone. The cowboy lifted his hat from the dirt, placed it back on his head, still kneeling, still calm. The boy lifted his chin, swallowed hard, and let himself feel the first spark of relief. She is here. He is here. The promise holds. Shadows lengthened. Dust swirled. The burned cross leaned steady in the late sun. They didn't speak. Words weren't needed. The balance had shifted. Power had failed. The boy and the man remained, guarding, kneeling, unbroken, witnessing what the sheriff had tried to erase. They came at night. The boy's voice was low, shaking like the dirt under his hands. He didn't look up, didn't move from the grave. The cowboy stayed kneeling beside him, hat in hand, eyes scanning the edges of the field, listening to the memory as if it were happening again. "How many?" the cowboy asked. "Enough. Enough to break her," the boy said. "To scare the living out of her, to make her believe the land would swallow her if she spoke." "What did they say?" the cowboy pressed. "They said she talked too much." The boy's fingers dug into the dirt, leaving shallow lines, tiny scars across the grave. The cowboy noticed the fresh edges of the soil, the way the ground seemed to hold tension, as if it had remembered every footstep, every curse whispered in the dark. The sheriff's name came up again, and the boy spat. "He denied it," the cowboy said quietly, but he didn't argue, didn't need to. The land itself was tense, the silence heavy with old fences, burned-out wells, the skeletal remains of barns long abandoned. The boy lifted his eyes briefly, haunted, hollow, and whispered, "They came with torches. They came with chains. I stayed. I didn't move. I watched them take her, take everything." The cowboy's hand twitched, but he stayed kneeling. He let the words land, let the anger and grief build, like letting a storm gather its weight. He said they burned letters, diaries, receipts. She kept track, he said, fingers shaking. She kept records of what they did, who they were, the debts they owed, the lies they told. He swallowed hard. I watched. I had to. The cowboy stayed low, silent. There was no comfort to offer here. Nothing could fix what had been done. The boy's breath hitched, but he stayed kneeling, guarding, watching. The wind picked up, scattering dust and dry leaves across the grave. The night seemed alive, shifting, whispering accusations that no one dared speak. The boy pressed his hands harder into the dirt. The cowboy watched his small shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the fear folded into determination. This was the truth, raw and ugly. And now it was visible. The sheriff's voice had come through rumors, through threats, through lies. It would come here too, and the boy knew it. That's why he stayed. That's why the dirt, the burned cross, the empty fields, they were not just a place. They were evidence. A line drawn in the land that could not be crossed without consequence. The cowboy finally shifted slightly, not to stand, not to move forward, but to adjust his weight, to let the boy know he was still present. The boy's eyes flicked up. He did not speak, but the glance said everything. "You're not alone. I'm here." He was, and that was enough for now. The night stretched. The stars blinked cold and distant. The boy whispered names, one after another, names of people who had hurt her, who had erased her, who had denied her existence. The cowboy listened. Not a word of judgment. Just presence. Just bearing witness. That was the only thing that could balance the scales, and it was fragile, but it was theirs. A branch snapped somewhere near the edge of the field. The boy stiffened. The cowboy's hand hovered near his belt, ready, but he didn't move. Whoever it was, whoever came, they would have to face both of them. The boy's shoulders squared slightly. The dirt under his nails, the bottle by his side, the memory of her words, they gave him a kind of armor the sheriff could not cut through. Then the order came. The sheriff's voice, hard, sharp, through the distance. "Dig. Take him away. Make the boy leave." The boy's jaw tightened. He did not flinch. The cowboy stayed kneeling, but the weight in his presence shifted, solid, undeniable. He would not allow them to touch this ground, not while he lived. The boy pressed his hands into the dirt. "You can't take her," he whispered, voice raw. "I can't let them," the cowboy said, soft but firm. The wind carried their words together, carrying them across the fields, across the burned fence lines, across empty barns and dry wells. The land heard. The night heard. The sheriff's deputies started moving, cautious, hesitant. The power they thought they held slipped, unsteady. The boy's small figure, defiant, was enough when combined with the cowboy's quiet insistence. Authority had been challenged, and the balance had shifted. The grave remained a line in the dirt, untouchable, sacred. The boy's hands were scraped and raw, but he stayed kneeling. The cowboy's knee burned, but he stayed too. Together, they were unbroken. The sheriff cursed under his breath, backing away, realizing that digging, tearing, erasing, none of it would undo the truth that had been made visible. The boy whispered again, almost to the grave itself, almost to her. "I saw them. I remember." The cowboy's hand hovered just above the boy's shoulder, offering quiet support without breaking the ritual of the vigil. They didn't need words. The ground, the cross, the dirt, these were witnesses. The boy was witness. The cowboy was witness. Finally, the sheriff gave a sharp order, and his deputies left, uneasy, unsettled. The boy let his bottle drop. He sank to his knees beside the grave, pressing his hands into the soil, feeling the heat of memory, the weight of history. The cowboy leaned slightly, not touching, just close enough to share the burden. shadows stretched across the field. Dust swirled. The burned cross held steady. Power had failed. And two kneeling figures remained, guarding, witnessing, unbroken. The boy whispered, "I guard her. I guard her." The cowboy nodded. "I'm here too." The wind carried the words, scattering them across the empty fields. The night seemed to still, listening, acknowledging, bearing witness alongside them. The grave stayed. The truth stayed. And for the first time in a long time, the boy could breathe without fear. The cowboy lowered himself back to his knees, slow, deliberate, letting the dust settle around him like he owned nothing but the ground beneath. The boy stared, confused at first, then cautious, then something like hope flickered in his hollow eyes. "You're making this worse," the sheriff spat from a few feet back. "No. I'm making it seem," the cowboy said, voice low but unshakable. The sheriff's smile twitched and disappeared. "Get up," the sheriff barked. "No," the cowboy said. He stayed kneeling. The boy's hands hovered over the dirt, then slowly, carefully, he sank down beside the grave. He imitated the cowboy, knees pressed into the warm soil, hands steadying over the burned cross. They were two shapes bound to one promise. One act of kneeling, and the balance had shifted. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He looked at the boy, looked at the cowboy, and tried to measure courage he had never seen before. One deputy hesitated behind him, shifting weight from foot to foot. His hand went to the brim of his hat, then he pulled it off slowly, uncertain. The others shifted too, whispers in the dust. Authority was fracturing. The boy's breath came ragged at first, chest rising and falling fast. The cowboy stayed still, calm, letting the boy feel the rhythm, feel the strength. "This is how you hold," he said silently. The sheriff's hand hovered over his gun again, the familiar threat, the final warning. "Last warning," he said. The boy's jaw clenched. "She said fire would come," he whispered. The wind picked up, rattling dry branches and old fencing, carrying with it the scent of smoke from somewhere distant. The boy's eyes flicked toward the horizon, calculating. The sheriff cursed, face darkening, and barked orders again, but the men hesitated. They had seen what kneeling could do. They had felt its weight. One by one, authority started to falter. The cowboy's hat was in his hand again, resting on the dirt, fingers wrapped around the brim. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The boy pressed his hands harder into the soil, steadying himself. He was learning. He was practicing. Every muscle held tension, every nerve alert. They were ready, even if the sheriff wasn't. The sheriff stepped closer, voice rising. "Stand up. Move. Leave." The boy didn't budge. The cowboy didn't budge. Two kneeling figures, defiant, unbroken, rooted to the ground. The dirt itself seemed to thrum under them, carrying weight they had no name for. The burned cross leaned sideways, still intact, still a witness. One deputy shifted again, taking half a step toward the grave, then froze. Another removed his hat slowly, uncertain. Fear passed quietly between them like a chain, and the sheriff's orders began to lose shape. He cursed again under his breath, face tight, eyes scanning, trying to find a way to assert control that no longer existed. The boy whispered again, almost to the grave, almost to the air, almost to the cowboy beside him. "She said fire would come." The wind seemed to respond, carrying it across the field, across the burned fences, across the dry wells and empty barns. The warning had weight now. It wasn't just memory. It was present, and it demanded recognition. The sheriff's hand twitched near his gun again. Threats, authority, fear, they all stacked up, but the kneeling figures held steady. The boy's body was tense but controlled. The cowboy's presence was a solid, quiet insistence. Neither yielded. The sheriff's voice lost strength with every word. Power faltered against resolve, against ritual, against truth made tangible in the dirt and burned wood. Minutes passed. The deputies glanced at each other, uncomfortable, unsure, witnessing courage they hadn't counted on. The boy's breathing evened out. His hands left shallow marks in the dirt, steadying himself. The cowboy leaned slightly toward him, not touching, just close enough to anchor him. Together they formed a line no badge could cross. The sheriff cursed one last time, a low, sharp sound. He took a step back. The deputies followed, uneasy. Authority was fractured. Fear had shifted sides. The boy remained kneeling. The cowboy remained kneeling. The burned cross leaned slightly in the wind, steadfast. The dirt held its heat, the grave held its secret, and the field waited with them. The cowboy shifted slightly, fingers brushing the brim of his hat, a silent signal to the boy. Hold. Watch. Learn. The boy's chest rose and fell in time with the cowboy's slow breathing. The sheriff had retreated. Power had failed. The field, the grave, the burned cross, the two kneeling figures, they were all that remained. Witnesses. Guardians. Unbroken. The boy whispered again, softly, almost a prayer. She said fire would come. The cowboy nodded. I see it. I feel it. The wind caught the words and carried them across the empty land. Shadows stretched across the grave, over the burned cross, and the two kneeling figures, steadfast, unbroken, waiting. Authority had faltered. The promise held. The boy breathed steady for the first time, feeling weight shared, feeling presence, feeling the ground beneath them as more than dirt. It was justice. It was memory. It was a vow kept. A gunshot cracked the night like a whip, sudden and sharp. The boy ducked instinctively, bottle falling from his hands. The cowboy stayed kneeling, calm, eyes scanning the shadows, waiting for the source. Smoke curled from a distant barn, red-orange glow licking the roof, flames hungrily devouring the dry wood. Someone had set it on fire. She did, the boy whispered, voice trembling. She's dead. Not to the ground, the cowboy corrected softly, voice low, steady, like reminding a child of a rule that mattered. The sheriff swore, scrambling toward the blaze, barking orders to his deputies. Chaos spread through the field, horses whinnying, dust rising thick and stinging. The boy's chest heaved, stomach tight with fear and awe. He pressed himself closer to the cowboy, who remained calm, a tether in the storm. The fire painted their faces in flickering light, the shadows shifting with every tongue of flame. Who lit it? The sheriff demanded, voice sharp, pointing at the distant glow. The boy's eyes met the cowboy's. She did, he whispered again, but this time his voice had defiance behind it, small but hard. The cowboy didn't argue. He stayed low, careful, feeling the heat and the rhythm of the burning barn. Smoke swirled, acrid, thick. The sheriff's authority faltered. The fire was bigger than his orders, bigger than his presence. The boy's hands pressed into the dirt again, fingers leaving shallow marks, grounding him, steadying him. He had watched her burn before, and now the land seemed to answer, rising in heat and smoke, remembering. The cowboy stood slowly, lifting the boy, arms careful beneath his ribs, steady as a beam of wood, carrying him away from the flames. The barn crackled behind them, a grotesque symphony, a chorus of old sins finally exposed. The sheriff cursed, face tight, frustration boiling. His voice carried across the field, shaking with anger, but no one responded. The deputies didn't move forward. The flames had spoken louder than law. The boy clung to the cowboy, eyes wide, stomach nodding with adrenaline, awe, and fear. He was small, but the moment was vast, infinite in its violence and truth. Smoke blotted the stars, a curtain of orange and black. The fire's reflection danced across their faces, over the burned cross, the grave, the unbroken earth. The boy whispered again, she's watching, isn't she? The cowboy tightened his hold, careful not to squeeze, careful to keep them both steady. She always was, he said. The fire doesn't change that. They moved through the fields, away from the blaze, past broken fences and rusted tools, past wells that held only shadows. The cowboy kept them low, careful, listening to the distant roar of the flames. The boy's breathing slowed, still fast but more controlled. He pressed himself into the cowboy's side, the ground and heat between them a tether to safety. The sheriff's voice faded behind them. Orders lost meaning. Authority crumbled in the shadow of fire. The boy pressed his hands over the cowboys, instinctively feeling for direction, for balance, for something to hold on to while the land itself seemed to erupt with old anger. They walked slow, measured, careful not to trip over unseen roots, careful not to let the fire consume what they carried inside. The burned barn continued to spit sparks, the heat rolling across the fields in waves. The cowboy did not speak, only moved deliberately, keeping the boy close. The boy whispered, "Do we go back?" "Not yet," the cowboy said. "Not until it's done." The fire wasn't just destruction. It was memory. It was reckoning. And they would survive it, because they were together, because they had the ground, because they had each other. The boy looked over his shoulder once, at the glow of the flames, at the black smoke curling into the sky. He did not turn back. The cowboy kept him close. "She did this to remind them," he said softly. "She did it to remind them that some truths cannot be buried." The boy's eyes were wide. He nodded, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of the lesson. The field opened up before them, dark and empty, dust shifting across footprints, carrying the smell of smoke and dirt. The cowboy set the boy down gently on the ground, letting him feel solid earth again. The boy's hands touched the dirt, grounding him, feeling the heat recede from the blaze behind them. The burned cross was distant now, still visible, still a witness. They stopped. The boy's chest rose and fell. The cowboy's hand hovered near his shoulder, a tether, a promise. They didn't speak. The night carried their silence, thick and heavy with smoke, with memory, with the echo of violence finally voiced. The fire had answered old crimes, marking the land, burning the lies, leaving only the truth in the ash. The boy lifted his chin, eyes steady, voice low, trembling. "She stays here." The cowboy nodded. "She does." The barn burned behind them, but the grave stayed untouched. The dirt, the cross, the memory, they endured. The cowboy and the boy remained, breathing slow, steadying each other, tethered by the land, by the promise, by the vigil they had chosen. Shadows flickered in the firelight. Smoke drifted across the horizon, obscuring the sheriff and his empty authority. The boy's hands pressed into the dirt once more. He whispered, almost to the ashes, "She remembers." The cowboy placed a hand lightly on his back, firm but gentle. "We do too." They stayed there, silent, watching, unbroken, witnesses to fire, to grief, to the land that refused to forget. They crouched beside the old well, silent except for the boy's shallow breaths. The cowboy's hat lay beside him, dusted with ash from the distant fire. The night smelled of smoke and dirt, of charred wood carried on the wind. The well was old, cracked stone, half hidden in weeds, forgotten by everyone except the land itself. The boy peered over the edge, fingers trembling. Inside, letters wrapped in oilcloth shifted slightly. Names. Dates. Payments. Receipts. Proof of what the woman had kept, what she had endured, what she had planned. The boy's mouth went dry. She kept receipts. For what? He asked. For surviving, the cowboy answered quietly, voice low, steady. The boy's fingers brushed one package, careful, almost reverent. She documented everything. Every insult. Every theft. Every slight. Every lie. The cowboy watched him. Every movement measured. Every breath shallow, every muscle taut. The boy's eyes widened as he unwrapped one envelope, read the names, saw the dates, the small meticulous script she had left. The land had not forgotten. She had not been erased. She had left proof. Evidence. A plan for him to survive, for her memory to live. The boy whispered, "They can't take it now." The cowboy shook his head once. "They already tried. But we have this. The fire. The well. The letters. The ground remembers." The boy traced a name with his finger. His mother's. His jaw tightened. The cowboy leaned closer, just enough to guide him without touching, letting the boy feel the weight of truth in his own hands. The wind picked up, rattling the weeds and dry leaves around the well. The boy pulled another letter free, unwrapped it carefully. Payments made. Debts collected. Notes about threats. About the sheriff. About men who had thought themselves untouchable. She had left him everything. The cowboy stayed low, knee pressed to the dirt, hat in hand, watching him absorb it, learn it, carry it. She planned for you, the cowboy said. The boy's lips parted, almost a gasp. He didn't speak. He only nodded, fingers trembling over the paper. She thought of you. Always. Even when she was gone. Even when they tried to erase her. Even when the land and law had turned against her. She left instructions. She left you armor you couldn't see. The boy swallowed, jaw tight. It's not much. It's enough, the cowboy corrected, voice steady. She documented truth. That's power. That's proof. That's survival. The boy's eyes flicked to the cowboy. He had been kneeling beside him through fire, through threats, through silence, through grief. Now the evidence, tangible and undeniable, lay before him. He could feel the shift in the air. Authority was irrelevant here. The past had a witness. The cowboy's hand hovered near the boy's shoulder for just a moment, letting him feel steadied, anchored. You understand, he said. She left it for you to finish. The boy's hands shook slightly as he rewrapped the letters, careful, reverent, protective. This is ours now. The cowboy nodded. Not theirs anymore. The wind carried the distant crackle of the fire across the fields. Shadows from the well stretched long and thin, flickering over the boy's small frame. He pressed the letters to his chest, holding them like a shield, like proof, like promise. The cowboy stayed beside him, steady, kneeling. Their breaths synchronized. The world around them was still dangerous, still unkind, still filled with threats, but the burden had shifted. She thought ahead, the cowboy said softly. You can live because of what she left. The boy's eyes glimmered wetly in the moonlight. He pressed the letters tighter, whispered, This ends now. The cowboy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The boy's voice carried the weight. He had witnessed the fire. He had guarded the grave. Now he held the proof. The wind moved through the weeds again, carrying ash and smoke from the barn that still burned in the distance. The field was quiet except for their breathing, except for the soft rustle of dry leaves. The boy's shoulders eased just a little. The cowboy stayed kneeling, fingers brushing dirt. The well held its secrets, the letters held the truth, and the land itself seemed to nod in quiet approval. They rose slowly, careful not to drop the evidence, careful not to break the ritual of witness. The boy looked down at the well one last time. She kept everything here. The cowboy nodded. She planned for you. The boy's jaw tightened, determination hardening in his chest. This is the end of what they thought they could erase. The cowboy's knee pressed to the dirt once more. Steady. Solid. Present. Together, they were unbroken, carrying her memory and her proof forward, beyond fire, beyond authority, beyond erasure. The cowboy led the boy through the town, slow, deliberate. Dust rose from their boots, catching in the late sun. People paused on porches, in doorways, watching. Word traveled faster than a rumor. The letters were in the cowboy's coat pocket, weight pressing against his ribs. Secrets heavy as iron. He stopped in the center of the main street, facing the sheriff. The crowd gathered naturally, curiosity and fear mixing, forming a wall around them. You lying, the sheriff said, voice sharp, hand twitching toward his gun. Then say it loud, the cowboy replied, voice low but carrying. Put that down, the sheriff spat, glancing nervously at the crowd. Or what, the cowboy asked, calm, measured. The air was thick. Dust floated in beams of sunlight. The sheriff realized the power of truth was now visible, undeniable. The boy stood beside the cowboy, small but steady. He watched the sheriff, his jaw tight, fingers brushing the brim of his hat. He did not move forward, did not flinch. The letters were the proof, the fire and grave already visible evidence, and now the cowboy would make it public. Names read aloud. Dates. Payments. The men who had thought themselves untouchable exposed. The crowd shifted, murmuring, eyes wide. Fear passed from them to the sheriff. Whispers turned to low gasps. The sheriff's mouth opened, closed, tried to form commands, but the words faltered. He had no control here, none. Authority had been tested in the fire, the grave, the well, and it had failed. He was alone against truth and witness. The cowboy pulled one letter from his coat. He read aloud, names, dates, the threats, the debts, the lies. Every word a hammer striking a wall of secrecy. The crowd leaned in. Eyes widened. People gasped. The sheriff's hands curled into fists. The boy watched quietly, absorbing it all, learning how power could crumble under truth, how fear shifted, how courage could be contagious. The sheriff's voice rose, tried to regain order. He barked at the crowd, at the deputies, at the cowboy. But no one moved. The letters held the weight now. The fire, the grave, the cross, they were witnesses, and the proof had teeth. The cowboy's calm voice continued, steady, reading names, dates, debts, lies, each syllable falling heavy across the street. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, turning into questioning, turning into accusation. The sheriff stepped back, jaw tight, authority cracking. The boy's small frame pressed closer to the cowboy. He had stayed through fire, through graves, through threats, through smoke, and now he watched as the world shifted around him. Fear had changed sides. Truth was no longer hidden. The cowboy paused, letting the weight of each name sink into the town. The sheriff's face was tight, pale with frustration, realizing he could not control this, could not erase this, could not bury it again. The boy's eyes flicked from the cowboy to the sheriff and back. Courage, he realized, wasn't loud. It was steady. It was presence. It was kneeling beside truth when the world expected you to bow. The crowd leaned in further, listening, murmuring, shifting. Some stepped closer to see the letters, others whispered to neighbors, eyes darting back at the sheriff. Authority was fading, influence slipping, control evaporating like smoke. The boy felt the balance tip beneath him. The cowboy had kept his vigil, kept the promise. Now the town itself bore witness. The sheriff cursed again, muttering under his breath, realizing that his threats had lost weight. The letters were evidence. The boy and the cowboy were witnesses. The land, the fire, the grave, they all remembered. He stepped back, defeated, realizing that no badge could erase the truth that now sat before the eyes of everyone. The boy stepped forward, small but deliberate, moving between the cowboy and the sheriff. He raised his chin, chest stiff. Authority had shifted, fear had shifted, and the weight of truth now rested in the hands of a boy and the man beside him. The sheriff's glare followed him, but it had no teeth. Not anymore. The cowboy stayed beside him, steady, calm, a solid presence. The letters were no longer hidden. The fire had burned the lies. The grave had held the promise. Now, with the town watching, the boy was unbroken. He had learned how power could crumble, how courage could spread, how justice could be claimed quietly, deliberately, and visibly. The sheriff stepped back, muttering curses, his deputies following, reluctant, uneasy. The crowd murmured, eyes wide, whispers growing. The boy stayed still, proud and defiant, a small figure against a once feared authority. The cowboy's hand hovered near his shoulder, steadying, anchoring, offering silent support. Together, they had shifted the balance. Together, they bore witness to truth. The wind swept dust across the street. Shadows from the burning remnants of the distant barn flickered across the boy and the cowboy. Names had been read aloud. Lies had been exposed. Fear had changed sides. The boy's hands tightened at his sides, eyes scanning the retreating sheriff. The cowboy nodded once, quiet approval. The town had heard it all. Authority had faltered. Courage, witness, and truth had won the day. The boy exhaled, finally, slow, steady. The cowboy remained beside him, kneeling slightly, hat in hand, letting the boy absorb the weight of the moment. The letters were safe. The proof was visible. The promise had been honored. The world had seen. Shadows lengthened, dust swirled, and two figures remained in the center of the street, unbroken, steadfast, witnesses to fire, to truth, to power reborn in the hands of the vigilant. The grave was finally marked properly, simple but solid, a wooden cross carved clean and unburned. The boy knelt beside it, hands pressed to the soil, chest rising and falling slowly. He was small, tired, filthy, but steady. The cowboy stayed beside him, kneeling too, hat off, hands resting lightly on his knees. The world felt still around them, quiet in a way that carried both grief and relief. "She can rest now," the boy asked softly, eyes flicking to the fresh cross. "She already is," the cowboy said, voice low, measured. The boy swallowed, stomach tight from hunger and exhaustion. "What about me?" he asked, voice barely audible. "You live," the cowboy replied. That was enough for now. The boy pressed his hands into the dirt, tracing the letters, feeling the permanence of it. She was gone, but the promise she made was honored. The wind rustled through the fields, carrying faint smoke from the burned barn far behind them. Dust and ash had settled, leaving the ground soft, still warm beneath their knees. The boy reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of jerky, and broke it in half. He held one piece for the cowboy, who shook his head. "Eat yours first." The boy hesitated, then nodded, chewing slowly, deliberately, savoring the taste after days of nothing. The cowboy's eyes stayed on the horizon, vigilant even in stillness. The boy's gaze moved between him and the grave, lingering on the burned edges of memory and the fresh lines of proof. This is what she wanted. This is what she left for him. The cowboy shifted slightly, letting the boy feel steady, anchored, present in a way the child hadn't been since he'd taken his first vigil. The ground beneath them seemed to breathe, holding both loss and redemption. The cowboy finally placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, careful not to push, careful to let him hold his own weight. The boy pressed back just a little, leaning into the presence, feeling it as solid as the earth under their knees. Together, they were unbroken. Together, they were witnesses to her memory, to the truth, to survival. The boy brushed dirt from the cross with the back of his hand, smoothing its edges, straightening it in the soil. He whispered her name, low, reverent, and the cowboy's hand rested lightly on his shoulder again. They stayed kneeling, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of grief settle into something quiet, something steady. "She told me you'd kneel," the boy said finally, voice soft but clear. The cowboy's head tipped slightly, eyes meeting the child's. "She didn't tell me how hard it'd be to stand back up," he answered. The boy exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders, chest rising and falling in calm rhythm. The field around them was empty now, witnesses gone except for the wind through broken fences, the shadows of burned barns, and the long memory of the grave. Dust settled over the cross, over the dirt, over the space between them. They remained kneeling, quiet, present, guardians of what could not be erased. The boy's hands lingered on the soil, tracing faint lines where footprints and marks had been pressed in grief and defiance. The cowboy watched him, letting him take it all in, letting him learn that standing up didn't always mean moving, that courage could be found in kneeling, in waiting, in bearing witness. The sun dipped low, light stretching long and soft across the field. The boy chewed the last of the jerky, letting it sink slowly. The cowboy stayed steady beside him, quiet, breathing slow, letting the child absorb the weight of survival, of memory, of justice finally done. The wind carried a faint smell of smoke and ash, reminders of fire, of destruction, of things that had to burn before truth could stand. The boy pressed his hands once more into the soil, feeling the permanence of the grave, the promise honored, the memory unbroken. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself in the quiet. The cowboy shifted slightly, leaning back, eyes scanning the horizon, still vigilant but unthreatened. The boy's gaze met his. They did not speak. Words were unnecessary. The grave was marked. The proof was held. The promise was fulfilled. Life continued, slow, deliberate, quiet but steady. Finally, they rose together, carefully, deliberately, leaving the dirt and cross as they were, marked, steady, permanent. The cowboy's hand brushed the boy's shoulder one last time, a silent acknowledgement. They had honored the past. They had faced fire, authority, erasure, grief. And now, kneeling beside her one last time, they could both move forward, carrying memory, truth, and survival with them. The boy looked up at the cowboy, eyes soft, voice trembling. She told me you'd kneel. The cowboy's lips curved faintly, head tipped slightly. She didn't tell me how hard it'd be to stand back up. They remained there a moment longer, shadows stretching, wind moving softly, the field holding still. The grave, the boy, the cowboy, they were unbroken. The story had ended, quietly, firmly, at last.